Now, from Local 24, a special presentation, The Mid-South's Hidden History, honoring Black history.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Mid-South's Hidden History. I'm Katina, Rankin.
And I'm Richard Ransom. Memphis is a city rich in civil rights history, of course. Activists taking to the streets to fight for their rights.
And during the next 30 minutes, we're talking about events and people in Black history that are rarely discussed. And we're sharing some of those hidden moments.
So we're going to begin with a family that dedicated their lives to civil rights. I'm talking about the Lee sisters from Memphis, Tennessee. They were pioneers of the civil rights movement. More than 50 years later, they remain very proud of their title as the most arrested civil rights family in the United States.
Yeah, Jet magazine, a popular weekly for Black Americans, gave the freedom-fighting sisters that moniker after they were carted off to jail nearly 20 times. Their only crime? Standing up against racial injustices by sitting in at libraries and lunch counters. The Lee sisters were teenagers in a racially charged 1960 South. Not only did their courage through activism get them trips to jail, it also got them blackballed from jobs. Local 24's Rudy Williams reveals the hidden history behind this socially conscious family.
Nobody questioned, should we do this? You know, it was let's win, let's do it.
We spoke with Brenda Lee Turner, Peggy Jane Lee, and Elaine Lee Turner, 3 of the 7 Lee sisters. Together with sisters Sandra Lee Swift, Joan Lee Nelson, Ernestine Lee Henning, and the late Susan Lee, they were arrested 17 times between 1960 and 1966.
We grew up in an environment where there was a close family, and we talked about how things should be and were not, and that if we ever got a chance to make a difference, we would do that.
That chance came in 1960. The eldest sister, Ernestine Lee, led her sisters into the civil rights fight when she joined schoolmates from Lemoyne College in Memphis during a sit-in at one of the city's white-only libraries.
We knew we were ready for that.
With their parents' support, the Lee sisters would spend the next 6 years marching, picketing, and sitting in.
We had picketed so many times. I mean, picketing was just what we did all the time.
The Lee sisters have been lauded as pioneers of the civil rights movement in Memphis, honored with trophies from various organizations, including an historic marker aptly placed on Main Street in downtown Memphis, where they helped integrate lunch counters.
As we sat down, they would put closed signs on the restaurant counter, and then we'd move on to the other one. They put closed there, but we would just make our rounds from one to the other to the next one.
The Lee sisters knew change had to happen soon.
I felt that we had a certain amount of power because we were on the side of right. They knew we were right, but they nevertheless had to hold on to these old ideas.
You would see a truck roll by with white men on it with guns. And so it impacted me that this was a serious thing that was going on, that there were actually people who were ready to kill us. And when they looked at us and hurled insults at us, they meant it.
Being arrested was one thing, but the possibility of being killed for what they believed was another.
Our parents believed in God and strong faith in God, and I knew they were prayerful. They understood the danger even more than we did because of their growing up.
They leaned on the prayers and faith of their parents because their legacy required them to speak out and take action.
So we just stepped on out each day like this is our mission, and it was our time to do this.
I had no fear during those times. The only thing that I thought they were going to do was arrest me, and that was no problem as far as I was concerned.
A change was going to come to Memphis.
Reporting from Memphis, I'm Rudy Williams.
And the Lee sisters say they would do it all over again. Sisters Elaine Lee Turner and Joan Lee Nelson co-founded Heritage Tours and Slave Haven Museum in Memphis, where they teach visitors from around the world Black history year-round.
They also support recent efforts in towns and cities across the country to bring down Confederate statues as well as protests against police brutality.
And Dr. King, he came to Memphis in 1968, and that was for the sanitation strike.
But he did not come alone. Coming up, hear from a friend of Dr. King's who walked with him every step of the way.
You're watching the Mid-South's Hidden History on Local 24.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. will forever be an icon of the civil rights movement, from the March on Washington to that fateful day on the balcony of the Lorraine Motel.
Yeah, Dr. King did not march alone. Memphis native Reverend Harold Middlebrook was a longtime confidant of King's and was with him every step of the way. Middlebrook was an assistant pastor at Middle Baptist Church in 1968 and worked to bring Dr. King to Memphis for the sanitation strike.
Now retired and living in Knoxville, Tennessee, he still speaks fondly of his friendship with Dr. King. Local 24's Teresa Smith continues our look at the Mid-South's hidden history.
I'm convinced that God has a plan for your life. In Jeremiah, he says, I have a plan for you. I know the plan I have for you.
At age 75, the Reverend Dr. Harold Middlebrook's passion for civil rights still burns strong. It started for him as a child in segregated Memphis, Tennessee.
Our teachers would teach us history. You know, my mom was subject to wake you up at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning and tell you to sing the second verse of Lift Every Voice and Sing. And the folk in my house, my grandparents and my mother and them, would sit around the breakfast table in the morning, read the paper, and talk about issues.
As a young man, the civil rights movement was coming to a boil. The African American community was demanding justice, and a young preacher named Dr. Martin Luther King was making headlines.
So when Martin King started in 54, and 55 and 56 with the Montgomery, we kept up with it every day in my household. And our teachers would have us to subscribe to the Commercial Appeal newspaper, which was a daily paper.
Reverend Middlebrook would go on to college at a prestigious school in Atlanta, where his life would take a turn.
I graduated and went on to Morehouse, did a summer program as a Woodrow Wilson student, and got involved with Lonnie King, Herschel Sullivan, Julian Bond, and all of that crowd in Atlanta for the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights.
Now a part of the vanguard for the revolution of equality, Reverend Middlebrook was facing some of the hardest moments of his youth.
Ended up going to jail, and then ended up going to jail with Dr. King in Atlanta in 1960.
His friendship with Dr. King would land him in tense situations with local police.
They went out to the car and got a rubber hose and came back to proceed to whip me with the rubber hose. Now here's the difference. The tire iron can leave bruises and scars visible. The rubber hose leaves you wounded on the inside.
There, on the day that Dr. King was assassinated, Reverend Middlebrook reminds us all that the movement was bigger than one man.
The dream was not just Martin's dream. It was the dream of thousands of people who had suffered through segregation, humiliation, degradation. And now here was their opportunity to strive to be free, to be liberated.
As we gather this morning,
Reverend Middlebrook retired from pastoral care at Cannon Baptist Church of Christ 3 years ago. He's slowed down a bit, but is still pressing for change.
When I look at the 50 years ago, it merely challenges me that with whatever years I have left and whatever strength I have left, I've got to continue fighting.
Reporting from Knoxville, Tennessee, I'm Teresa Smith.
And Reverend Middlebrook continues to tell the stories of his time with Reverend King and the movement to countless school and community groups.
Very good. Well, Orange Mound is a Memphis neighborhood rich in history.
But did you know it was the first neighborhood in the country built by and for African Americans? Coming up, you'll meet Orange Mound's most prominent residents.
You're watching the Mid-South's Hidden History on Local 24.
Memphis is home to the first community in the United States built by and for African Americans.
The historic Orange Mound community has thrived since the 1890s, but has been tested through the civil rights movement and the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King several miles away.
Local 24's Annette Pegler spoke to the community's most prominent members about the hidden history behind this hidden jewel.
There was so much love, so much innovation, so much community unity here.
Mary Jones Mitchell is referring to her community, the Southeast Memphis neighborhood known as Orange Mound. In the 1890s, the Dedrick family sold the land to L.Z. Meacham for $100. Meacham then sold the land to African Americans living in Memphis.
It's the first community in America founded and developed exclusively for African Americans to buy land and own their own home.
Black business owners, doctors, and lawyers built homes in the neighborhood over the following decades. By the 1940s and 50s, it was a thriving African American community.
We know that this place was just rich with jewels.
81-year-old Jones Mitchell vividly remembers how it endured the civil rights years.
We had meetings, we had marches, we had voters registration. Orange Mound Civic Club was dynamic in getting people to vote.
Mitchell says the churches in Orange Mound were a place of refuge during segregation in the civil rights movement. One of those churches was Mount Pisgah CME Church.
We believe that from a holistic perspective, that we have a responsibility not just to build big buildings and continue to expand without giving back to the community.
The church burned down on the first Sunday of the year in 1948. To this day, no one knows what caused the fire.
I remember standing outside watching. I remember my mother was crying.
The church rebuilt and is now the second oldest church in Orange Mound. Lillian Bumpus has been a member for 82 years.
It has really served as an anchor because so many of the children come back.
But with every great success story comes a struggle. During the 1980s and 90s, Orange Mound started to go downhill.
A lot of property became rental property. Many people have bought in the community, but they're not living here.
Revitalization efforts started in 2000 and included building a new Orange Mound Community Center.
Second group.
Seniors can now enjoy dancing, playing cards, and shooting pool. Joyce Shaw teaches theater.
It was like tapping into old dreams. They were very active in high school with the theater department or something.
And most recently, the community welcomed its first art gallery.
2 years ago, this was an abandoned liquor store.
Jones Mitchell says for those who were born and raised here, there's something special that binds them together. You likely ate a hot dog from Miss Bradley's, enjoyed live music at Handy Theater, and graduated from Melrose High School.
We dominated football in the city and in the state in the 50s and the 60s.
And it's that camaraderie that keeps this neighborhood thriving. Reporting from Orange Mound in Memphis, Tennessee, I'm Annette Pegler.
In 2015, Orange Mound received a national honor. President Barack Obama gave the neighborhood the Preserve America Presidential Award.
It honors our community, which has best used its historic assets for economic development and community revitalization. And there are also quite a few notable athletes who came from Orange Mound, all graduates of Melrose High School.
Barry Wilburn won a Super Bowl with the Washington Redskins. Cedric Wilson won a Super Bowl with the Pittsburgh Steelers. And Andre Lott, Washington, won a national championship with the University of Tennessee Volunteers. How about that?
Awesome. Well, you know, African Americans fighting in World War I and II did so during segregation, and that means they fought overseas for America's freedom while also struggling for their own rights right here in the U.S.
So coming up, we take you to the nation's capital and tell you about the double victory for the Black service members who made history.
You're watching the Mid-South's Hidden History on Local 24.
Well, they fought for freedoms that they didn't have themselves while serving our country.
Many of us know the history of World War I and II, but we may be less familiar with the double meaning the wars had for African American soldiers.
In this hidden history story, Local 24's Bree Jackson tells us about the service members who helped save lives and make history.
They fought overseas for America's freedom while struggling for civil rights in America. Now, some of those service members are honored at the National African American History and Culture Museum. Curator Crosty Salter says the exhibit Double Victory shares stories of the two battles facing black troops during segregation.
These men and women were always willing to fight. They were willing to fight for their country. And they were not only fighting for themselves and equality for themselves, but equality for their community and equality for great America.
At the time, opportunities for African Americans were extremely limited, both in society and in the military. The photos and artifacts in this exhibit introduce visitors to barrier breakers like Charles Young.
He's the third African American to graduate from West Point in 1889. And talk about a hidden history and a connection. He is the officer that mentored Benjamin O. Davis.
Benjamin O. Davis Sr. was the first African-American general in the U.S. military. Despite discrimination, these men were among the few black service members to rise through the ranks. Then, World War I galvanized the black community to serve in an effort to make America achieve true democracy.
Because if you serve, you earn citizenship, equality, democracy.
By World War II, the number of African Americans enlisted or drafted rose significantly. Salter says leaving rural areas in the South to serve overseas had a unique impact on black soldiers.
And when they got overseas in France, the French people welcomed them with open arms. They were treated with a level of equality that they had never experienced back home. And so that caused some American soldiers not to even come back to America, and they stayed in Europe and became expatriates.
But most did return to the U.S. Among them was Charles Hamilton Houston. The first lieutenant went to Harvard and became a key player in the fight for civil rights.
Fought overseas in the 92nd Division and came back to America. That was not what he and others were promised. And so he became a lawyer, and he is one of those individuals who taught individuals like Thurgood Marshall, and we know what Thurgood Marshall went on to be.
Marshall was the first African-American Supreme Court justice, and another who returned to the civil rights battle at home was Medgar Evers, an activist who was the first field secretary for the NAACP and worked to end segregation at the University of Mississippi before making the ultimate sacrifice.
So he survived World War II only to be assassinated in his driveway in 1963.
Medgar Evers, along with Benjamin O. Davis and Charles Young, are among the veterans buried here at Arlington National Cemetery. Salter says it's important to tell their stories today so that we don't forget all the things African Americans fought for abroad and at home. In Arlington National Cemetery, I'm Bree Jackson.
More than 2.5 million African American men registered for the draft, and 1 million served as draftees or volunteers in all of the branches of the armed forces during World War II.
Most African American men who served were in the Army and were relegated to segregated combat support groups. When they returned home, many found themselves fighting for equal access to employment, housing, education, and voting rights.
You're watching the Mid-South's Hidden History on Local 24.
I'm Richard Ransom.
And I'm Katina Rankin. If you enjoyed exploring lesser-known stories of Black history, then go to our website, localmemphis.com, and look for Mid-South Hidden History.
Go there and you'll find web extras such as extended interviews and behind-the-scenes tours.
Thank you for taking this journey with us through the Mid-South's Hidden History.